The dust of the Cunner Valley settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the tongue and found its way into the sealed mechanisms of expensive rifles. It clung to the canvas of the command tent where Elara Vance stood, a ghost in civilian trekking gear amidst a sea of multicam. The Rangers of Alpha Company, 75th Regiment, saw a woman who didn't belong. They saw soft edges, the gray at her temples, the quiet stillness of a bureaucrat or a visiting dignitary. They thought she was visiting, a piece of brass-approved baggage on a fact-finding tour. They were wrong. The conflict was simple. They saw a tourist, but a moment was coming that would force them to see a weapon. That moment waited on a distant ridgeline, 3,000 yards away, where a problem was taking root. For now, she was just an obstruction, a puzzle they didn't care to solve. The air inside the tent was thick with the smell of stale coffee and nervous energy. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man carved from granite and impatience, looked up from a satellite map splayed across a folding table. His eyes, chips of blue ice, scanned her from her worn boots to her unassuming face. He didn't offer a seat. "Vance, is it?" he began, his voice a low growl accustomed to instant obedience. "Your file is thin. Says you're here as a strategic operations advisor from the Pentagon." He said the word Pentagon, like it was a communicable disease. "Yes, sir," Elara replied. Her voice was level, betraying none of the weariness from the 3-day journey to this remote outpost, FOB Bastion. Thorne leaned forward, placing his palms flat on the map. The gesture was pure intimidation. "Let me be clear. I don't need advisors. I need trigger pullers and intelligence analysts. I need men who can hump a pack 80 pounds up that ridgeline and still be effective. This is the sharp end of the spear. There's no room for observation decks or policy reviews." He was dismissing her, consigning her to the category of useless weight before she'd even had a chance to acclimate to the altitude. She could feel the stares of the other 2 officers in the tent, a captain and a lieutenant, both mirroring their commander's skepticism. They saw a woman past her prime, a civilian interloper in their tightly knit world of masculine hardship. Inside, Elara felt a familiar, cold settling. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet resignation of a tool being left in the box. She had been the sharp end of the spear for 2 decades. She had forgotten more about being effective under fire than these men had ever learned. But her file was thin for a reason. Her real history was buried under layers of black ink and national security classifications. "I'll stay out of your way, Colonel," she said, her gaze steady. "I'm just here to observe operational readiness." Thorne snorted, a short, sharp sound of contempt. "Readiness, right? Find a cot in the transient billets. Try not to get in the way of the men with actual work to do." He turned back to his map, the dismissal absolute. The interview was over. As Elara stepped back out into the blinding sunlight and the swirling dust, she passed a fire team of Rangers cleaning their weapons. One of them, a young specialist with Tanaka stitched on his uniform, nudged his partner. They watched her walk toward the sad collection of tents reserved for visitors. Their smirks were visible even from a distance. She ignored them. Dismissal was a language she understood fluently. It was the silence before the storm, the calm that preceded the violent, undeniable proof of purpose. She let their assumptions settle around her like the dust. It wouldn't be long before the wind changed. The next 48 hours passed in a haze of structured idleness. Elara Vance did not stay in her billet. She walked. Her movements were slow, deliberate, a study in economy. She traced the perimeter of FOB Bastion twice a day, once at dawn and once at dusk. The Rangers, when they noticed her at all, assumed she was stretching her legs, a bored civilian fighting off the monotony of deployment. Sergeant Omar Hassan, a platoon sergeant with a face like a worn leather map, watched her from the low wall of a mortar pit. He saw her stop near the western watchtower, her head tilted, her eyes scanning the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. She wasn't looking at the view. She was watching the wind. Hassan saw her hold up a hand, not to shield her eyes from the sun, but to feel the subtle shifts in the air currents funneling through the valley. She'd crouch, plucking a pinch of the ubiquitous dust and letting it trickle from her fingers, watching its trajectory as it was carried away. It was a sniper's trick, an old one, a way to read the invisible rivers of air that could push a bullet yards off its course over extreme distances. Hassan had taught it to his own spotters. He frowned, a flicker of curiosity disturbing his professional indifference. Who was this woman? Alara's mind was a whirlwind of calculations. The valley was a nightmare for ballistics. The sun heating the rock faces created unpredictable updrafts. Cold air cascaded down from the snow-dusted peaks, creating crosswinds that shifted in velocity and direction every few hundred feet. She logged it all mentally. Morning mirage was worst between 0800 and 1100, a shimmering distortion rising from the valley floor that made distant targets dance and warp. Afternoon winds were predominantly from the west-northwest, but a secondary channel of air pushed through a narrow gorge to the south, creating a shear point at approximately 1,500 yards. She cataloged firing positions. The roof of the concrete chow hall offered a stable platform with a clear 270-degree field of fire, but it was exposed. The earthen berm on the north side was better, lower profile, but the angle to the highest peaks was too severe. The western watchtower, designated Watchtower 4, was the optimal position. It was elevated, stable, and offered a commanding view of the most likely avenues of approach. From there, a skilled marksman could command the entire valley. Her deep observation went unnoticed by most. Specialist Tanaka and his squad mates joked that the Pentagon lady was trying to get a tan. They saw her staring into the distance and assumed she was homesick or lost in thought. They couldn't see the complex equations spooling through her mind, the mental map she was building, layered with wind speeds, temperature gradients, barometric pressure, and the subtle pull of the Earth's rotation. She was not observing operational readiness in the way Colonel Thorne understood it. She was preparing. It was a discipline hammered into her by 2 decades in a world where the penalty for being unprepared was absolute. Her past was a ghost that walked with her, whispering of angles and trajectories, of the patient, lethal mathematics of the long shot. While the Rangers saw a visitor, Alara Vance was unconsciously sighting in the entire valley, turning the hostile landscape into a familiar workspace. She was waiting for a problem to solve, because that was the only way she knew how to exist in a place like this. The pressure began as a crackle of static over the radio in Thorne's command tent. A reconnaissance drone, a quiet predator circling at 20,000 feet, had painted a new target. The image that filtered onto the main screen was grainy but unmistakable. Perched on the knife edge of a distant ridge known as the Dragon's Tooth, was a sophisticated piece of enemy equipment. It was a high-gain communications relay, daisy-chained to a powerful optical sensor package. It was solar-powered, well-camouflaged, and positioned with malevolent genius. "What's the range on that?" Thorne barked, his voice tight. The intelligence officer, a young lieutenant, tapped at his keyboard. "From the nearest viable OP, approximately 2,800 yards, sir. Maybe a little more." A tense silence fell over the tent. Under 2,000 yards was a difficult shot. Over 2,500 was expert territory. At 2,800, pushing 3,000, with the valley's treacherous winds, it was considered a shot of pure luck, not skill. "It's live," the lieutenant added, his voice strained. "We're seeing signal bursts. They're watching our patrol rotations. They can probably see right into the wire from that angle. It's a direct threat to force protection." Thorne's jaw clenched. An airstrike was an option, but the target was small and tucked against a rock face. The risk of missing and giving away the drone's presence was high. It would also announce that they knew about the device. A small, deniable ground team was impossible. The terrain was too treacherous for a covert approach. It had to be a sniper, a single, perfect shot. "Get Hassan's team on it," Thorne commanded. "I want that thing gone. Now." The call went out. Sergeant Omar Hassan and his spotter, Corporal Davies, were considered the best marksman team in the battalion. They grabbed their M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, and moved with practiced urgency to Watchtower 4. Alara heard the rising tension in the radio traffic from the chow hall, where she was nursing a cup of lukewarm tea. She saw Hassan and Davies jog toward the tower. She knew, with a cold certainty, what was happening. She had seen this scenario play out a dozen times in a dozen different countries. A critical target at an impossible range. She walked out of the chow hall and stood near the base of the tower, her gaze fixed on the distant dragon's tooth, a jagged silhouette against the pale blue sky. She could feel the wind on her face, a steady 10-mile-per-hour crosswind from the left, but she knew that was just the ground wind. Higher up, near the ridge, it would be a different beast entirely. The radio on a nearby sergeant's belt crackled to life. It was Hassan's voice, strained. "First round is away." There was a long pause. Then, "Mississippi impact was low and right. Wind is pushing it more than we thought." Adjusting. Another pause. Another report. Second round away, a longer, more frustrated silence. "No joy. That was a clean miss. Mirage is boiling out there. The target is swimming." Panic, quiet and controlled, began to seep into the radio chatter. Thorne's voice cut through, sharp and angry. "What's the problem, Sergeant?" "Sir, the distance is extreme. The wind shear past the gorge is unpredictable. We're holding for a 20-mile-an-hour crosswind up there, but it feels like it's gusting higher. We're burning through ammo trying to walk it in." Alara closed her eyes. She could see it perfectly in her mind. The bullet leaving the barrel, fighting the wind, losing velocity, succumbing to gravity. She could see the invisible wall of air pushing it down and away. They were misreading the signs. They were treating it as a single wind problem when it was a problem of multiple stacked layers of air moving at different speeds. They would never hit it. Not like this. Thorne was running out of time. The enemy now knew they were being targeted. Soon, they would pack up their gear and vanish, their intelligence already gathered. The pressure was building, a palpable wave of desperation washing over the FOB. Sergeant Hassan's voice came over the radio again, the professional calm in his tone fraying at the edges. "Colonel, we've fired 6 rounds. We can't get a consistent read. The wind is a vortex up there. We're bracketing the target, but we can't land a hit. We're guessing." In the command tent, Thorne slammed a fist on the table, rattling the coffee mugs. "Guessing is not an option, Sergeant. That relay is broadcasting every move we make. Find a solution." "Working on it, sir," Hassan replied. But the confidence was gone, replaced by the grim reality of failure. On the ground below Watchtower 4, Alara watched the dust devils dance across the valley floor. She could see the frustration in the rigid set of the shoulders of the rangers clustered nearby, their faith in their best marksmen beginning to waver. They were a tribe built on competence, and right now, competence was failing them. The problem wasn't the rifle or the shooter. It was the physics of the environment, a puzzle too complex for the tools they were using. She took a slow breath, the gritty air filling her lungs. She had remained silent, an observer, just as she had promised. But the promise was to a man who didn't understand what he was asking her to ignore. This was not about operational readiness anymore. It was about lives. The intelligence that Relay was gathering would be used to plan an ambush, to target a patrol, to kill American soldiers. Her soldiers, whether they knew it or not. Her stoicism was a shield, but it was not her nature. Her nature was to solve problems, to act. The cold, disciplined part of her that had been dormant for 2 years began to stir, the instincts honed by 1,000 similar moments rising to the surface. She looked from the distant, mocking glint on the dragon's tooth to the tense figures in the watchtower. She had seen enough. She started walking toward the ladder of Watchtower 4. Her steps were unhurried, but each one carried a weight of decision that seemed to press her boots deeper into the soil. The rangers near the tower turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Specialist Tanaka, who had been relaying messages, took a half-step forward as if to block her path. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," he said, his voice respectful but firm. Alara didn't break her stride. She met his eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, he saw something flicker behind her calm facade. a flash of intensity so profound it made him instinctively step aside. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. She climbed the ladder, emerging onto the cramped platform. Hassan and Davies were hunched over the rifle, their conversation a low, frustrated murmur. The air was thick with the smell of burnt powder and defeat. They looked up as she stepped onto the platform, their faces slick with sweat. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you can't be up here," Hassan said, his patience worn thin. Alara ignored him. Her eyes were on the rifle, the spotter scope, the Kestrel weather meter in Davies' hand. She looked past them, out at the ridge, and the world seemed to slow down. The noise, the tension, the desperation. It all faded into a quiet hum. There was only the target, the wind, and the math. She turned her head slightly, her gaze finding Sergeant Hassan's. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, devoid of arrogance or emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. "Let me try." Hassan stared at her. The sheer audacity of the request left him momentarily speechless. This civilian, this woman from the Pentagon, wanted to take the most difficult shot of his career. He opened his mouth to refuse, to tell her to get the hell off his platform, but the words died in his throat. He saw the same look Tanaka had seen, a deep, unwavering focus that seemed to burn away the chaos around them. It was the look of a predator. The radio crackled. It was Thorn. "Hassan, what's your status? Talk to me." Hassan hesitated, his eyes still locked on Alara. He was out of ideas. His pride was a small thing compared to the safety of his men. He made a decision, one that would either make him a fool or a footnote in a legend. "Sir," Hassan said into his radio, his voice tight, "we have an advisor up here. She wants to attempt the shot." The silence on the other end was long and heavy. Alara could imagine Thorn's face, the disbelief warring with his desperation. Finally, his voice came back, laced with weary fury. "Is this a joke, Sergeant?" "No, sir," Hassan said, his gaze unwavering from Alara. "It is not." Another pause, longer this time. The fate of the mission, and Alara's chance to prove herself, hung in the balance. Every ranger on the FOB who could hear the radio traffic held their breath. "Fine," Thorn finally bit out, the word dripping with scorn and resignation. "She has one shot. One. Then get her out of there and prepare to scrub the mission." Thorn out. The permission, however reluctant, was granted. A subtle shift occurred on the platform and among the men listening below. The mood changed from dismissal to a kind of morbid, disbelieving curiosity. They were about to watch a civilian bureaucrat try to do what their best ranger sniper could not. It was theater. Hassan stepped back from the rifle, his movements stiff. "It's all yours, ma'am." The ma'am was formal, but the edge of mockery was unmistakable. Alara didn't acknowledge it. She moved into the space he had vacated, her actions fluid and economical. She didn't immediately put her eye to the scope. Instead, she ignored the M2010 completely. She picked up Corporal Davies' spotter scope, a high-powered Leupold, and swiveled it not towards the target, but towards a point about 500 yards to its left, focusing on a patch of sun-bleached rock. Davies started to protest. "Ma'am, the target is..." "Quiet," she said, the word not loud, but carrying an authority that silenced him instantly. She stared through the spotter scope for a full minute, her fingers making minute adjustments to the focus ring. She wasn't looking for the target. She was reading the mirage. The shimmering waves of heat distortion, which had so frustrated Hassan's team, were a language to her. The direction and speed of the waves told her exactly what the wind was doing at different distances. She saw the main channel of wind Hassan had identified, but she also saw the subtle countercurrent from the gorge, and higher still, a third, gentler stream of air flowing in a completely different direction. It was a triple-decker sandwich of wind, and they had only been accounting for the top layer. She put down the scope and finally turned to the rifle. She lay down on the dusty platform, her body creating a low, stable base. She settled in behind the stock, her cheek finding the cold polymer of the cheek rest as if it were an old friend. "What's the range to the target?" she asked, her voice muffled by her position. 2,840 yards, Davies answered, sounding like a reluctant student. Atmospherics. Temperature 88 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity 15%, barometric pressure 2989 and falling. Alara processed the numbers. She didn't look at their ballistic calculator. She didn't need it. She was doing the math in her head, a complex algorithm refined over 2 decades. Range, temperature, pressure, spin drift, the Coriolis effect for a shot of this latitude and azimuth. And the wind, the 3 layers of wind she had just observed. "Give me 385 mils of elevation," she said calmly. Davies and Hassan exchanged a look of sheer disbelief. Their calculations had called for 34 mils. Her adjustment was huge, seemingly arbitrary. It meant she was aiming an incredible distance above the target to account for the bullet drop. "Ma'am, that's way too high. You'll shoot over the whole mountain," Davies stammered. 38.5 mils, she repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She reached up and clicked the elevation turret herself, the precise, tactile clicks echoing in the tense silence. Then she turned to the windage knob. "And give me 42 mils left." This was even more shocking. They had been holding right for a right-to-left wind. She was holding left into the wind. It defied everything they had been taught. "You're holding into the wind?" Hassan asked, unable to keep the incredulity out of his voice. "The primary wind is from the left, yes," Alara said, her eye now pressed firmly to the scope. "But the shear at 1,500 yards is stronger. It will push the bullet right. The 3rd layer, near the peak, is a gentle right-to-left. I'm not holding for one wind. I'm holding for the aggregate effect of all 3-inch. The science in her explanation was so precise, so confident, that it silenced them completely. The scoffing curiosity from the rangers below had evaporated, replaced by a thick, nervous anticipation. They were witnessing something they didn't understand, a level of mastery that was utterly foreign. Alara Vance was no longer a bureaucrat. She was an artist, and the rifle was her brush. The valley was her canvas. Her world shrank to the circular image in the scope. The target, the enemy relay, shimmered and danced in the mirage. She ignored the movement, focusing instead on her own body. She began to breathe, long, slow, rhythmic breaths. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Exhale for 6. She slowed her own heart, waiting for the natural pause between beats. In that silent, still moment, the body is perfectly calm. That is when the shot must be taken. She saw the target in the crosshairs. She wasn't aiming at its center. She was aiming at a specific point, the primary antenna feed horn, a small, vulnerable junction box no bigger than a fist. A disabling shot, not a destructive one. More difficult but more precise. It would sever the device's ability to transmit. Her finger rested on the trigger. She applied steady, rearward pressure. The world was gone. The noise was gone. The doubting rangers, the impatient colonel, all gone. There was only the crosshair, the target, and the space between. Inhale. Hold. The pause between heartbeats. She broke the shot. The M2010 bucked against her shoulder, a violent but familiar kick. The sound, a sharp crack boom, echoed across the valley. Through the scope, she watched the vapor trail of her own bullet, a faint, corkscrewing wisp fighting its way through nearly 2 miles of hostile air. It was a long flight. 1 second, 2, 3. For seconds passed, an eternity of suspense. And then, a tiny puff of dust and shattered plastic erupted from the relay. Not from the rock beside it or above it. From the exact point she had been aiming. The antenna feed horn disintegrated. A collective gasp went through the watchers below. On the platform, Corporal Davies, his eye glued to the spotter scope, could only whisper, "Hit. Dear God, it's a hit." But Alara was already working the bolt, the motion smooth and practiced, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. "It's disabled but not destroyed," she said, her voice a low murmur, almost to herself. "The optical package is still functional. They can still see us." She settled back behind the rifle. The first shot had stunned them. The second would be her masterpiece. The target was the camera lens itself, a piece of glass no larger than a silver dollar, now almost 3,000 yards away. The wind hadn't changed. Her calculations were confirmed. "Same hold," she stated. Again, the breathing, the calm. The world narrowed to that tiny circle of glass. She accounted for the slight change in angle, the minuscule drop in barometric pressure. She adjusted her hold point by a fraction of an inch within the scope. Inhale. Hold. Pause. The rifle cracked again. The second bullet began its long journey. This time, everyone was watching, holding their breath. For seconds later, the lens of the optical package starred, then shattered, a spiderweb of fractured glass glinting in the sun before the entire unit went dark. Silence. A profound, echoing silence descended upon FOB Bastion. It was broken by a single, choked word from Sergeant Hassan's radio. It was Colonel Thorne. "Status." Hassan fumbled for his radio, his hand shaking slightly. "Sir, target is destroyed. 2 rounds. 2 hits. Relay and optics are gone." The silence from Thorne's end was different this time. It wasn't anger or impatience. It was the sound of a man completely recalibrating his understanding of the world. Alara worked the bolt again, ejecting the second spent casing. She pushed herself up from the ground, her movements stiff but controlled. She didn't look at Hassan or Davies, whose faces were masks of pure, unadulterated awe. She simply walked to the edge of the platform and looked out at the valley, her expression as unreadable as ever. The problem was solved. That was all that mattered. In the humming quiet of the command tent, Colonel Marcus Thorne stared at the static-filled screen that had, moments before, shown the enemy relay. The intelligence officer was babbling about trajectory and standard deviation, but Thorne didn't hear him. He heard Sergeant Hassan's report over and over in his head. 2 rounds, 2 hits, at nearly 3,000 yards, in a wind that had defeated his best team. It wasn't just impossible. It was supernatural. He spun around, his eyes landing on the thin manila folder on the corner of his desk. Vance's file. The one he had dismissed as useless. He snatched it up and tore it open. The first page was the sanitized, unclassified summary he had already seen. Strategic Operations Advisor. Pentagon Liaison. But tucked behind it was a second, sealed envelope marked with a crimson border. Classified, eyes only, SOC command. His fingers, usually so steady, fumbled with the seal. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a heavily redacted service record. Most of it was blacked out, mission names, locations, unit designations, but some things were left visible. Vance, Alara M. Rank, Master Sergeant. Retired. Last assignment. Redacted. Specialty. Sniper. Advanced Tactical Reconnaissance. Callsign, Spectre. The name hit Thorne like a physical blow. Spectre. It wasn't just a call sign. It was a ghost story, a legend whispered in hushed tones in classified briefing rooms and special operations bars. Spectre was the operator from the mythical, long-disbanded Task Force Orion, a unit tasked with asymmetric solutions to impossible problems. The stories were legion, though never confirmed. A general taken out from a moving helicopter at 2 kilometers. A fuel depot detonated by a single shot through a valve from across a bay. Spectre was credited with some of the most difficult and politically sensitive eliminations of the last 20 years. The file listed 3 confirmed kills beyond 2,500 meters, one of which was noted as being over 3,200, a number so extreme it was considered apocryphal by most of the community. Until now. Thorne sank into his chair, the paper trembling in his hand. He looked at her date of retirement. 2 years ago. The Strategic Operations Advisor role wasn't a cushy retirement job. It was a cover. A deep, unassuming cover for one of the most lethal soldiers the United States had ever produced. He had not just dismissed her. He had insulted a living legend. He had handed a Stradivarius violin to a child and told her not to get in the way of the real musicians. The shame was a hot, bitter taste in his mouth. He picked up his radio handset. "Sergeant Hassan." "Sir," came the immediate reply. "My compliments to Miss Vance. Tell her I'd like to see her at my command tent." At her convenience, the words felt inadequate, clumsy. The phrase "at her convenience" was not in his normal vocabulary. It was a mark of respect he hadn't offered anyone below the rank of general in a decade. He stood up and walked to the tent flap, looking out at the watchtower. The small group of rangers who had been clustered at its base were still there, but they weren't talking or joking anymore. They were standing in silence, their gazes fixed on the platform where Alara Vance stood alone, looking out at the mountains. Their posture had changed. The casual slouch was gone, replaced by a rigid attention, the kind of stillness reserved for moments of great importance. They were looking at her not as a woman, not as a civilian, but as a force of nature they had just witnessed firsthand. The revelation was complete, not just for Thorn, but for the entire company. The ghost of FOB Bastion now had a name. Alara finished cleaning the M2010 with meticulous care. Every trace of carbon, every speck of dust was removed. She worked with a practiced, almost reverent motion, her hands moving over the steel and polymer as if they were extensions of her own body. She was in the armory, a small, bunker-like structure that smelled of oil and metal. The rifle was not hers, but she treated it with the respect due to any tool that performs its function perfectly. When she was done, she handed it back to the company armorer, who took it with a nod of silent awe. As she stepped out of the armory into the fading afternoon light, she saw Colonel Thorn waiting for her. He wasn't standing near his command tent. He had walked halfway across the compound to meet her. He was alone. The platoon of rangers that had witnessed the event was engaged in their evening routines, but a profound quiet had fallen over the base. All eyes were on the two of them. Thorn stopped a few feet from her. He looked older than he had that morning, his certainty shaken, his arrogance sandblasted away by the events of the day. He stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, a formal military posture of address. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice low and steady. He corrected himself immediately. "Master Sergeant." Alara's expression didn't change, but she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She had not used that title in 2 years. Hearing it from him was an acknowledgement of the world she had left behind, the world that had just bled through into her present. "I reviewed your complete file," Thorn said. He didn't apologize. An apology would have been an insult, an attempt to smooth over his disrespect with cheap words. Instead, he offered something far more valuable, professional recognition. "That was the finest marksmanship I have ever seen, or heard of." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. The chips of blue ice were gone, replaced by a deep, hard-won respect. "We are honored to have you here." He extended his hand. It was not the perfunctory handshake of a superior officer, but the firm, solid grip of a fellow warrior. Alara took it. The handshake was brief, but it resonated across the compound. It was a public transfer of status. As they dropped their hands, Sergeant Omar Hassan approached. He stopped a respectful distance away, flanked by Corporal Davies and Specialist Tanaka, the 3 men who had been the most direct witnesses to her skill. Hassan did not speak. He simply brought his heels together and gave her a slow, formal nod. It was more than a greeting. It was a salute from one professional to another, a gesture of profound deference. Davies and Tanaka followed his lead, their young faces etched with a humility they hadn't known that morning. Alara met Hassan's gaze and returned the nod, a small but significant acknowledgement. The dismissal she had faced was a distant memory, erased not by argument or complaint, but by the simple, undeniable evidence of competence. She had not demanded their respect. She had commanded it with 2 rounds, fired across a valley of wind and doubt. The message was clear. The quiet woman they had mistaken for a tourist was the most dangerous person on the base, and now they all knew it. The sun bled out behind the western peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. The crisis was over. The daily rhythm of the FOB began to reassert itself, but something fundamental had shifted. The air was still charged with the residue of the impossible. Alara Vance did not join the men in the chow hall for the evening meal. Instead, she found herself drawn back to the northern perimeter, to the earthen berm that overlooked the valley. She sat on the packed dirt, her legs crossed, her back straight. The wind that had been her adversary was now just a cool evening breeze, whispering through the rocks. She reached into the cargo pocket of her trousers and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was one of the spent brass casings from the M2010, ejected onto the floor of the watchtower. She had picked it up before she left, a habit she'd never broken, a small, brass memento of a problem solved. She held it in her palm, the metal still faintly warm. It glinted in the last rays of the dying sun, a tiny, perfect cylinder of manufactured purpose. To the Rangers, it was just a piece of spent ammunition. To her, it was a symbol. It was the physical manifestation of her identity, the part of her that transcended files and ranks and the assumptions of others. It was proof. Her past was a heavy cloak, one she had tried to shed in retirement. But here, in the stark, unforgiving landscape of the Cunner Valley, she had been forced to wear it again. The stoicism, the discipline, the quiet observation, they were not affectations. They were the armor she had built around a core of lethal skill. Today, the armor had cracked, and the light had shone through. She wasn't angry at Thorne for his dismissal, or at the young Rangers for their mockery. They operated within a system of clear hierarchies and visible capabilities. She was an anomaly, a variable they couldn't account for. Now they could. A figure approached in the gathering darkness. It was Specialist Tanaka, the young soldier who had tried to block her path at the base of the tower. He held 2 steaming mugs. He stopped a few feet away, hesitant. "Ma'am, Master Sergeant." He corrected himself, his voice quiet. I brought you some tea." He offered one of the mugs. Alara looked at him, then at the mug and accepted it. Her fingers brushed his as she took it. The tea was hot, strong, and sweet. "Thank you, Specialist," she said. Tanaka stood there for a moment, shifting his weight, clearly wanting to say more but not knowing how. "What you did today," he started, then trailed off, shaking his head. "We've never seen anything like it." "You did your job," Alara said simply. "The wind was the problem." He nodded, though he knew it was more than that. He was beginning to understand that there were levels of skill that were simply beyond his comprehension. He was looking at one. "Good night, ma'am," he finally said, and retreated back into the shadows, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Alara took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. She looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the valley, the dragon's tooth now just a black shape against a sea of stars. She had arrived as a ghost, an invisible woman. She was still quiet, still unassuming. But now, when they looked at her, they would see. Her dignity was intact, her value proven. She closed her hand around the warm brass casing, a silent testament to the fact that here, at the sharp end of the spear, true respect is never given. It is earned. And her payment had been delivered from 3,000 yards away.